الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فأتيا فرعون فقولا إنا رسول رب العالمين أن أرسل معنا بني إسرائيل قال ألم نربك فينا وليدا ولبثت فينا من عمرك سنين وفعلت فعلتك التي فعلت وأنت من الكافرين قال فعلتها إذا وأنا من الضالين ففررت منكم لما خفتكم فوهب لي ربي حكما وجعلني من المرسلين وتلك نعمة تمنها علي أن عبدت بني إسرائيل قال فرعون وما رب العالمين. Go to Pharaoh and say, we are messengers from the Lord of all worlds, commanded to say, let the children of Israel go with us. Pharaoh protested, did we not raise you among us as a child, and you stayed several years of your life in our care? Then you did what you did, being utterly ungrateful. Moses replied, I did it then, lacking guidance, so I fled from you when I feared you. Then my Lord granted me wisdom and made me one of the messengers. How can that be a favor of which you remind me, when it was only because you have enslaved the children of Israel? Pharaoh asked, and what is the Lord of all worlds?
Allah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulilah. Alhamdulillahi alladhi hadana lihada wa ma kunna linahtadiya lawla an hadana Allah. Laqad ja'at rusulu rabbina bil haqq. Wa salawatullah ala nabi, حبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم إلى يوم الدين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Normally I'd say I'm really happy to be in Sheffield. I am because of you guys, but the roads coming into Sheffield, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. It's no wonder why, just the traffic conditions were pretty terrible. It's no wonder why ITV, Channel 4, BBC didn't opt to stay here. And that's a true story, by the way. It's because there's only one road or two roads that lead within Sheffield. So traffic congestion is pretty bad. Alhamdulillah, it's nice to be back. It's been about 6 to 7 weeks, I think it is. It feels like 6 to 7 years, perhaps. I hope you guys are re-energized post-exam period. Insha'Allah, Allah grant you all success. Have you got your results or you haven't got your results? Oh, okay. Insha'Allah, you've put the effort. I hope you put an effort with a capital E. And of course, the result is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I pray that Allah grants you all success. Ameen. So we're going to talk about the next chapter on the agenda, which is the war on terror. It's a particularly emotive topic for myself, and you'll kind of come to understand why that is. But it's also a particularly emotive topic for the entirety of the Muslim world even today. I would hold and contend that pretty much every single part or bit of oppression that you see in the Muslim world today is justified through the prism of war and terror. So if you're unable to understand, if you're trying to make sense as to why oppression is happening, why there is arbitrary injunctions on Muslims, why the passports of Muslims are taken away without any due process, why Britain and America can arbitrarily take funding away from UNWR as an example, why the ICJ ruling that came out through the court case in South Africa has very little repercussions on Israel. To understand all of these subject matters, it's imperative that we understand the war on terror. as the war on terror explains absolutely everything really in our context. So welcome back, Alhamdulilah, it's good to see you all. I hope, Jazakallah khair, that's very kind of you, Ammar, mashallah. I'm not going to go through review everything, all of the, everything's on YouTube, which I've never really said in my life, but there we go. We obviously went through a number of different subject matters, and for anybody who's new, I'd encourage you guys to log on to the University of Sheffield ISOC or USIC YouTube page, Insha'Allah. But I do want us to focus first and foremost on the hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, narrated in At-Tirmidhi. It's narrated in a number of different places, but the strongest chain is in At-Tirmidhi. They will come upon the people at a time when holding on to the deen of Islam will be like holding on to hot coal. And that, in my opinion, and inshallah you will see that this hadith is very perfectly explained in light of the war on terror context, right? The war on terror context has made becoming and being a Muslim an incredibly, incredibly difficult thing to do, because it has security repercussions, it has ideological repercussions, it has economic repercussions, it has so many different repercussions. And on the face of it, it brings a number of different disadvantages of being Muslim. You know, in the modern world, there's a number of different material disadvantages of being Muslim, and that's why Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has warned us that there will come a time where being Muslim, becoming Muslim, maintaining your sense of identity as a Muslim will be all the more difficult. And I do believe that the war on terror has made the landscape a lot more difficult. These are some pictures. Some of them are iconic pictures for the wrong reasons. And some of them are pictures that represent the last perhaps 2 decades of the history of Muslims. So does anybody know what this is? Nope. Mm-mm. Yes. This is Tower of Babel. This is Malwiya, right? This is Malwiya or Masjid Malwiya. It's actually the oldest. It is the oldest preserved as it is masjid in the entirety of the Muslim world. It was built in the Abbasid era by the Khalifa Mu'tasim Billah, right? And it is in Samarra, which is just north of Baghdad, right? Really beautiful place. This is a house. I'm not going to ask you to guess, but this is a house. This is a house in Afghanistan, right? This is a house in Afghanistan. And what do you notice on the walls of the house?
Bullet holes.
Bullet holes. I've never been to Afghanistan, but I've been to Iraq, and a lot of the houses that you see are full of bullet holes, right? And people live in them, by the way. Now they live in them. What does this represent?
America.
Yes, the United States of America. And what incident does this represent? 9/11, right? So this was the day that supposedly the world changed. I'm actually going to change that conception. I think it did change, but there were a lot of things that happened before that. Does anybody know what this is? No? No?
Yemen.
No, it's in Iraq. It's in a place called Madain, right? And this is called Taq Kisra. So this was what is left of the palace of the emperor of Persia. There's a famous hadith. I can't remember the name of the Sahabi, but it was when he met the. So it was a famous incident when he went to the emperor and he said, "I'm here to bring you from the worship of man to the worship of the creator of man." Right? I'll get you the name, inshallah. But this is the famous incident where this happened in Iraq. And here we go to the legacy of the War on Terror and what we have experienced from the War on Terror. So does anybody know what this is?
Guantanamo Bay.
Guantanamo Bay? Yeah, so where is Guantanamo Bay?
Cuba.
Cuba. And we'll talk about Guantanamo. But Guantanamo has seen a number of detainees in the hundreds, almost 800. And it was created pretty much off the back of the war in Afghanistan and war of Iraq. It was created before that, but it was filled with people that were taken arbitrarily through Afghanistan and the Iraq war. Who's this guy? Muazzam Beg, yeah. So Muazzam Beg is the director, I'm just going to call it a director, I'm not sure what his actual role is, but of Cage. And Muazzam is was a detainee in Bagram in Afghanistan and also in Guantanamo Bay for a number of years until he was released. And now his life's goal is to expose the war on terror narrative. Does anybody know who this is? This is Dr. Afia Siddiqui, who is a doctor because of a PhD in neuroscience, originally from Karachi in Pakistan, resided in the US, studied in the US, went back to Pakistan, and was taken in by the American establishment and continues to be in prison in the United States of America. She is being held there on a sentence, on an 86-year-old sentence for conspiracy to fund Al-Qaeda, of which there is no evidence. And there continues to be people who fight her case. Does anybody know what this is? Does anybody know, aside from yourself, because we've spoken about this, what happened in Abu Ghraib?
Was this the one in Iran?
Yes.
A lot of bad things happened in Abu Ghraib. A lot of torture, mainly from the Americans.
So Abu Ghraib was a prison that was created by the Americans to hold Iraqi inmates. And this was just one of many prisons that were established by the British and the Americans during the War on Terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. In this particular one, there were a number of heinous things that were done to our brothers and sisters. There's a very famous video recording of a sister that was in Abu Ghraib that pleaded with the Muslims to help her, and she actually explained the things that the American soldiers were doing to her. And we continue with the legacy of the war on terror. Does anybody know what this is?
Uyghur camps.
This is the Uyghur camps in China, right? So the western part of China. So these are Muslims, these are Muslim brothers and sisters who are Turkic in origin, but they reside in a certain aspect of China. This is a concentration camp of which there are hundreds to thousands of Muslims. They are forced to marry Chinese people. Our brothers and sisters are forced to marry Chinese people, renounce the deen of Islam, completely take away any aspect or sign of Islam from their actual societies. I don't know if you can read the sign, but this is Burma in Myanmar. So this is the Rohingya issue, where the Burmese military went into the state of Rakhine, which is the western aspect of Burma, of which Muslims have resided for about 780 years and completely burnt the place, kicked out everybody that was there, and many of them now reside in Bangladesh. So they've been completely displaced. Then you've got the United States of America and the Muslim ban, which never actually ended up happening, but was instituted for a little while, where Muslims from a number of countries were stopped from coming to the United States of America. This is more of a representation of a sentiment that is present within America. And of course, the war on terror has also affected policy, which we spoke about in the last session before the exam break, which is prevent. And prevent is not just one policy. There are a number of prevents. Every single European country, in fact, many Muslim, so-called Muslim countries have an equivalent policy of prevent. Prevent was established by the Labour government and was developed by Labour and eventually perfected, so to speak, from their point of view, by the Tories, and has been promised to be continued by Labour. So I want to start off by going into a little bit of history, because the war on terror narrative is built on the narrative of terrorism, right? It's built on this word or on this phrase called terrorism. So it's important to kind of understand that terrorism didn't really necessarily start off with Muslims, okay? Because the argument is that we are an exceptional people, not in a good way, but in a bad way. There is something about us as Muslims that make us automatically terrorists. There is something about us as Muslims that make us predisposed to committing acts of terrorism, right? So any word of condemnation that comes from a Muslim about anybody else or any other thing is immediately denounced, because the argument is that actually you're the true terrorists, right? Anything that comes from any act, according to any international definition, that is a terrorist act, is never actually called a terrorist act. I don't know if you guys have noticed, yeah? When it's a geezer who's white, right? When it's a geezer who's white, right? Or is black, or whatever he may be, but he's not Muslim, you know, somewhere down the line it comes out that he's got mental health issues, right? Or, you know, when it's a 15-year-old girl who has planned, when it's a 15-year-old girl who has planned to undertake terrorist activities against Muslims, come to a case, she is held to be someone who is groomed. But when there's a 15-year-old that goes to Syria, her passport is taken away and she is told to be a terrorist sympathizer. So there are blatant contradictions. So the argument is that Muslims are the terrorists. There's no other terrorists aside from Muslims. That wasn't always the case, by the way. Terrorism was broader. It was associated with other things and other people. Does anybody know who this geezer is? This is like my dad's generation, really. But
James Bond character.
yeah, man, good. Yeah.
I can't remember his name.
I can't remember his name either.
Wait,
I wrote it down, but I left it in
which
my office.
James Bond was it? Was it the one before Daniel Craig?
Yeah. Oh, no, I mean, of course.
But was the...
This was
I
a.
know which movie you're talking about.
GoldenEye, is it?
No, it's not. No, it's not.
It's not GoldenEye. No. It's before GoldenEye. So sorry, from Russian with Love. Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember his name, but he's Russian basically. And if you notice, movies from the 70s, movies from the 80s, the Russian was the terrorist. Kind of is a little bit like that, but the terrorist label is not necessarily applied on Russia, right? It's different labels. But the Russians were the terrorists. Does anybody know who these guys are? Yeah, the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, right? The IRA. So these were people, and do you know who they famously killed? Mountbatten. So if you remember, yes, a few sessions ago we spoke about the separation of India and Pakistan. That was orchestrated by a guy called Mountbatten. And the IRA killed him, not because of the separation of India and Pakistan, of course. But they killed him because they wanted Ireland, initially as a whole, to be independent from England or from Britain. Does anybody know who these are?
Tamil Tigers.
Tamil Tigers. These are the Tamil Tigers, right? West Yorkshire massive, you know.
You can tell from that camouflage.
Yes. But anyway, so these are the Tamil Tigers. So they are they were a resistance organization, let's just call it as it is, that existed in Sri Lanka, that were sick and tired of the central government that only represented the interests of the Sinhalese, which are the predominant caste within Sri Lanka. So historically what you saw was that the label of terrorism was applied to a number of different groups, countries, entities, people, etc., etc. This takes me to another segment where we're going to see this term evolve. And we're going to put this together with the history of so-called jihadi groups. Because the evolution of the term terrorism, right, also came with the evolution of so-called jihadi groups, right? Fine. So these are people that have existed. These are groups. So this is, once again, a little bit of quizzing. And it's worth, with a VPN on, reading about some of these people. I'm only joking. But it's worth knowing about some of these people. They're also historical figures. All of them are dead, actually. Right? Pretty much. Right? They've all passed away. Right? Some of them naturally, some of them in resistance movements. So, does anybody know who this is?
The Chechen, Al-Qatab. Well, not Chechen. Was it Al-Qatab?
Has anybody else heard of this guy?
Mainly from my dad.
Mainly from my dad, yeah. I mean, same here, mainly from my dad too. So this is the Chechen. Well, actually, he's half Saudi. He's half from Saudi Arabia and half. Yeah, I think so, but I don't know. But he was a resistance fighter, right? He was called Commander Khattab, right? And he fought in a number of different battles, including the Afghan war against the Soviets, right? And also in Chechnya. This is a representation of the Chechen soldiers. Actually, the Bosnian soldiers, that's correct, yeah. This is the Bosnian soldiers. So does anybody know where, kind of why they existed, except for yourself? And except for you? Sorry? No, not these guys. But these guys, go on, Hamar.
Does that have anything to do with what Serbia was doing?
Correct.
Back in the 90s?
Correct. So they were resisting the Serbian genocide that was happening in Bosnia. So the Serbs believed themselves to be rightfully the owners of that land. So they went on a complete pillaging mission and killed a number of Muslims. And these guys were the resistance fighters. Khattab was ultimately sent by Saudi Arabia. The Bosnian fighter group was actually contributed by a number of different countries around the Muslim world, including Britain. So if you go to Walthamstow, which is where I'm from, and I said all good things and bad things have come from Walthamstow, right? There are a number of people in my dad's generation that had fought for the Bosnian resistance. It's known. It's completely known, right? It's a normal thing because they were funneled through by Britain in order to fight against the resistance. Reason being was because, and there's a theme here, those countries, well, the West were doing nothing about the genocide. So it needed to demonstrate that it was doing something for the genocide, right? So it funneled Muslims from the West. Who are these guys? Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I couldn't really find a great picture of the older Taliban kind of people. Yeah, this is the Pakistani, yeah. But the Taliban as an institution originally existed as a resistance front against the Soviet Union. And who was the Taliban supported by? Pakistan, right? Pakistan supported them, but then they were sponsored by the Americans, right? So he was sent by Saudi Arabia. They were sent by, well, they were added to by people from Britain, right? Facilitated by the West. These guys were funded by Pakistan, but vis-a-vis the Americans, right? And then you've got, does anybody know what this last picture is? Palestine. Do you know who they are?
PLO.
Yes, the PLO, right? The Fida'in, right? So this was the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And the Palestinian the PLO, right? Bismillah. The PLO at that time were funded by Jordan, Syria, and what could be considered as Lebanon at that time. Okay? They were funded by all of those organizations. The reason why I'm explaining these groups, and I'm also explaining how they came about, was that Mujahideen were ultimately paramilitary groups for states. They were paramilitary groups for states. That's not me saying that the people that were there were doing the bidding of their states, right? They felt that they were fighting a sincere resistance. But the reality was that they became paramilitary armies that were, on the face of it, independent actors, but in reality were sponsored and were pushed and were armed and were funded by their parent states. Does that make sense? Right? That's how the word or the term Mujahideen came. That's how jihadi groups came about, as an example, in the origin. Things change, by the way. Go on.
So would you say they're funded out of convenience for those nation states?
Yes, of course. They were funded because they were carrying out the interests of those nation states. Right? They were there to facilitate the interests of the nation states. Right? And this is very well known. Right? Very, very well known. Things changed though. Things changed massively. Right?
Just quickly, would the forces not have, like the paramilitary groups, would they have not formed even if there was no funding from like individuals who obviously had the intentions?
That's difficult to say, but we know that they were formed and they were funded. That's probably as far as I can stretch the conclusion. But does anybody know who this is?
Like the uniform.
Is that who?
Grand Mosque region.
Oh, the guy who came to Maki, that guy.
Has anybody seen, sisters, you know who this guy is? Someone. So this guy is Juhayman al-Utaybi. So if you read about the siege of Mecca, right? So Juhayman al-Utaybi was a geezer in 1979. He basically went into the haram and he proclaimed himself as the Mahdi. But it wasn't as simple as that. It wasn't that famous video on YouTube when the guy goes to a Zakir Naik talk and says, "I'm Imam Mendi," which is like, which is henna, right? And then, but this is an actual thing. So he actually ransacked. You know, subhanAllah, the videos on YouTube, the recordings on YouTube, right? Juhayman al-Utaybi is ransacking. So he took the speaker of the masjid and he basically said, "Ana Juhayman," and he explained, and then he positioned his forces, right? He positioned his forces and they basically took control over the haram, right? Does anybody know how he was taken out?
French and British special forces.
Okay, so the French came, okay? 1979, right? So the French came. Now, I'm going to talk about, does anybody know what these are pictures from?
Desert Storm.
Okay. Is anybody from Iraq here, by the way? Is anybody Iraqi now? Okay, fine. No problems. So this is the first Gulf War in 1990. Okay? This is the first Gulf War in 1990. And Saddam Hussein, essentially, he was very upset. I'm just going to call it upset. He was angry at OPEC, right, which was essentially the regulating body of the price and supply of oil internationally, continues to be, okay? And Iraqi oil was being punished because Kuwaiti oil was being made cheaper than Iraqi oil, right? That was the market price. He got angry and he basically took over Kuwait. That's essentially what happened. And he literally walked into Kuwait, essentially. Now, the threat it wasn't necessarily his threat, but the worry was that his next step would be Saudi Arabia. Okay? His next step would be Saudi Arabia. So essentially what had happened was the Saudis called upon the help of the Americans. Right? They called upon the help of the Americans. The deal was that let us build bases in Saudi Arabia, and if you do that, we'll come and help you. And then you had Operation Desert Shield, which was the building of bases around the Saudi-Iraqi border and also along the Gulf. And then you had Operation Desert Storm, which was actually the offensive against Saddam Hussein. Right? Now, the reason why I'm mentioning these two events is because two important things happened. Well, one important thing happened. In both of these cases, right, Muslim states, it's not necessarily that they're one Muslim state, but let's just say, Saudi Arabia in this case, called upon the help of not its paramilitary organization, but of a foreign nation. So you had paramilitary organizations, mujahideen, that were going to the political apparatus and saying, look, we will kick Juhayman out. Or they were saying, look, we will kick Saddam's butt. But in the first instance, it was, no, we're going to take the help of the French. And remember, it's a big thing, Like, imagine how you feel if you've got non-Muslims entering the haram. Right? It's a massive thing, right? So for these guys, it's like you're not just taking the help of the non-Muslim, from their understanding. You're also letting them into the vicinity of the haram. When we've got what it takes. The second thing also was that you're not just taking help from the Americans, but you're also letting them build 15 bases in Saudi Arabia. Right? So they feel they have just become completely sidelined. Yeah, the Mujahideen become completely sidelined. And this was supported by fatwa. There's a famous fatwa of Sheikh bin Baz, as an example, that allowed the taking of help from the Americans. And essentially the US was given permission to build bases all over. And this caused the creation of what is known as Al-Qaeda and its founding figures, Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. Is everybody following the narrative right now? Everybody's following the story, yeah? Okay. I'm getting somewhere with this, inshallah. Yeah. We're getting warmer. Yes.
So Sheikh bin Baz gave that fatwa. They were allowed to come in the US.
It was an incredibly controversial fatwa.
Like, what was his reasoning?
His reasoning was that in origin, this has been discussed a lot, yeah? So the famous opponent to Sheikh bin Baz was Albani, right? Sheikh Albani, rahmatullah alayh. That was the famous thing that happened. Sheikh bin Baz's argument was that in origin, it is permissible to take help from a non-Muslim. Right? Albani's position was, and it was undoubtedly the correct position in this, was that you can't isolate the action from the context. Because the context is that you're not just getting help, you're letting them walk all over you. Right? They're not going to give you money and that's it. Like, they're going to take over your bases, they're going to establish control, they're going to control your foreign policy, they're going to do all of those different things. That's what Sheikh Albani's argument was. And I think the history is the evidence of who was right, really. Right? But at the end of the day, ijtihad is ijtihad. Yeah? But,
Explain what ijtihad is.
Also, ijtihad is the derivation of ruling from the text. So there's a famous, for instance, some people are Hanafi but madhab and may pray like this. I'm Shafi'i and I pray like this. right? But the reality is that both positions are correct because they're taken from correct readings of evidences, right? And Muhammad ﷺ said the one who comes at the correct conclusion gets 2 rewards, and the one that comes to the incorrect conclusion gets 1 reward. In other words, it's the concerted effort and the reference to the Islamic text that counts. Inshallah. So this was what happened. This was how, yes.
Sorry, I don't really understand the full point. So what does it mean that this option, setting up American bases along the border instead of the loyal Mujahideen?
Okay, I'll explain. So, if you imagine, you're told your whole life that you're doing jihad for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're getting loads of reward. You're going to go into Jannah, right? You're being told all of that, right? And you're also told that you are my go-to person when anything happens. You guys. Because you're Allah's soldiers, right? You're Allah's soldiers. You're Muslim. You've got the deen, right? And then all of a sudden, Dave, not you, but Dave, as an example, yeah? He's like, any guy, he's, etc., etc. And he's, you're the favored party, yeah? You've been supported, you've been given everything, you've been told you're the representation of Islam, as an example. And you have weapons and capability and all of this. But the state that sponsors you, instead of going to you, despite, all of this investment has gone to Dave. Right?
So these Mujahideen weren't backed by the US like the
No.
Oh.
They weren't. They were independent. I mean, they were dependent on their state, which was Saudi Arabia in this case. The same happened in Syria. The same happened in Jordan. The same happened throughout the Muslim world. The same happened in Pakistan, as an example. The average Pakistani soldier didn't know that he was being co-funded by the Americans, right? As far as he knew, the funding was coming from the Pakistani Inter-Service Intelligence, the ISI, right? But it was actually coming from the Americans. But tacitly, there was always support from Western powers for these paramilitary organizations anyway. So whilst in this case, there wasn't any direct link between them, but ultimately, these nations have always been carrying out the plans of the West, right? They were just their soldiers to do that, basically. But they all felt betrayed. And that's why they started to form their own organizations, because they felt that would better represent the Muslim cause. Does that make sense now, inshallah?
And what was the reason that they chose America and not the others?
The reason why they chose, you mean why the states chose America? The reason why they chose America was that America was the power in the Middle East. So after I would probably say 1979, with the fall of the Shah, British influence in the Middle East disappeared in a flash. There is no Anglo-American struggle. It is America positioned itself as the global hegemon, continues to do so. So America made a number of promises, a number of agreements. We spoke about the Eisenhower Doctrine as an example, that if you feel that you're threatened by a neighboring power, we'll give you all of the money and the weapons, etc., to defend yourself. So the Muslim world felt, you know what, America's giving us everything. So they chose America, and America went in, and it led this coalition. So how did terrorism become the term it was? So we know this context. Now you have, all of these groups that have arisen, Muslim groups, as an example. They believe that they've been betrayed, and they believe that they want to do what they feel is in the interest of the Muslim Ummah. There were a number of key events that started to associate the term terrorism with Muslim. Okay? So we spoke about how terrorism was previously applied to lots of different places, or terrorists, or people. But then this changed. And these two events were the establishment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. And does anybody know what this is? the Islamic Revolution of Iran.
Storming the US embassy.
So we're going to come to that, inshallah. Now, what's very interesting, and by the way, this is all academic documented. The effort, and this is not conspiracy, although it's going to sound like conspiracy, but I promise you this is well known. There's a good professor you should watch. His name is David Miller. He is the professor that was from the University of Bristol, who was removed from his position because of his criticism on Zionism, right? He didn't criticize them, by the way, like on a different lecture. He was just giving a lecture on Palestinian and Israeli history, and he just called a spade, really. And subsequently he was taken off duties.
Who was the one who was... There was someone who went to, I think, Oxford Union debate. They did a protest. Or, like, there was a big uproar about that.
I might have missed that. No problem. So, the Iranian hostage crisis, 1979. So these were really, very, very important events that occurred. Okay, and this is the start of Islam equals terrorism, right? So it all started with something called the Jonathan Institute. Has anybody heard of the Jonathan Institute? So the Jonathan Institute was an institute that was funded and created by the Israelis, right? This is very well known. And its principal founder was a guy called Benjamin Netanyahu, right? Honestly, you can't make this stuff up, right? Sounds very familiar, right? Essentially what happened was that if you are an oppressed people and you are occupied, you are allowed to resist. I'll come back to it. You're allowed to resist, okay? You are allowed to resist. This is held according to international law, right? Whatever that means, right? But it is held according to international law. Now, what you started to see was that this narrative or this law started to have its conditions put on it. And there were two events. The first one was the PLO, who were trying to resist occupation, and they took up armed struggle, but they were allowed to do so under international law, right? They did a few things that were a little bit rogue, like the 1970-something Olympic bombing, 73, right? But generally speaking, they were still working within the confines of international law. The second thing that happened in 1979 was the Iranian hostage crisis. So the American embassy, so the people who worked in the American embassy were held hostage by the Iranians for 444 days, right? And the US had to negotiate their release. This was at the time when Ayatollah Khomeini came into power. So now what was happening was that a narrative was being created. Oh look, you've got two organizations in the same period that are going against Western state interests, and they're using questionable means to do that. So in comes Benjamin Netanyahu with a famous Orientalist called Bernard Lewis, right, who's written immense amount of filth about Islam, right, arguing that the concept of jihad in Islam, right, which by the way the Americans were supporting during the Afghan war, which Margaret Thatcher supported, right, famously, where she said, God save, something like God save the Mujahideen or something like that, right? But the argument that the Jonathan Institution was making with Orientalist thinkers and also Benjamin Netanyahu sponsoring it, the argument was that the existence of jihad as a concept proves that Islam is intrinsically violent. So any form of dissent, any form of activism, any form of criticism that comes from a Muslim's mouth is basically saying jihad, right? Or she is basically saying jihad. So violence when it comes to Muslims is not just an act of self-defense. This was the argument, yeah? It's not just an act of self-defense. Because Muslims inherently are aggressive. Yeah? Muslims inherently are aggressive. Right? I can get aggressive when I'm hungry. Right? You don't want to stop man from eating, right? But aside from that, I'm pretty laid back. You know, Muslims are expansionist. We want to just always just take over everything. Right? You know, we're inherently violent. Do you see the narrative? This is all the way back in the 70s, right? Developing and developing and developing. You can Google the Jonathan Institute, right? And Benjamin Netanyahu and all of these personnel. So this is when we started to see the conflation of two terms, Islam and terrorism. Because prior to this, you had good Muslim and bad Muslim. The Pakistanis are good Muslims because they support US interests. The Saudis are good Muslims because they support American interests. Anybody who carries out US plans within the Middle East is a good Muslim, right? And then you had, you know, bad Muslims. Previously there was a distinction between good and bad Muslims. However, when it came to the Iranian Revolution, when it came to the oil embargo that was imposed by Saudi Arabia, when it came to even, so this is what is quoted by the Institute, when it came to Malcolm X, right, as an example, all of these things prove that, you know, Muslims have the capability to oppose US policy, right? Therefore, we need to silence the Muslim voice completely. So therefore, all Muslims are terrorists. It's like perfect. The way it was designed, the way it came about, the way the narrative works. And of course, everybody jumped on it. The media jumped on it. Everybody jumped on it. And really the narrative came to fruition in Operation Desert Storm. The good Muslim, bad Muslim distinction became incredibly clear in Operation Desert Storm. Do you know who this is? Not yourself, not yourself, not yourself.
Margaret Thatcher.
No. Bismillah.
The America's like foreign minister or something.
This is Madeleine Albright. This is Madeleine Albright. May Allah's la'na be upon this lady. Right? Because she was the Secretary of State during Operation Desert Storm. So this was when the US and its allies completely took over Basra and going towards Baghdad. They imposed sanctions which killed, does anybody know the number? No, 500,000, 500,000. I'm sure it's 500,000. If it's worse than that, then even more upon her, yeah? But 500,000 children were killed directly as a result of the sanctions that they employed, right? Actually, it might be, it's 500,000 kids.
Yeah, 1.5 million, but it's mainly kids anyway. So
Yeah. Fair enough. So it's 500,000 kids, that's the stat that I know, were died as a result of the sanctions that were put on by them. And how was it justified? We're here to root out the terrorists. Right? We are here to root out the terrorists. So, where have we reached so far? Terrorism came to be defined initially in relation to the Israeli-Palestine conflict by the Jonathan Institute. And other things like the Iranian Revolution, Malcolm X, and other people were quoted as examples about how Islam is inherently violent, Islam is inherently jihadi, etc., etc. And it became the term used to discredit any resistance against US hegemony. Movements or paramilitary organizations who thought they were acting in the interests of Islam were betrayed by their hosts. They were let down, right? And then all of this opened up, because it opened up a frontier of fighting terrorism, right? After Operation Desert Storm, it opened up all of the bases around the Muslim world. And you saw an expansion of bases in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Qatar, the UAE, etc., 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 etc. right? Because it was all about fighting terrorism. Yes,
I
Habibi.
mean, I think it's also partly due to like a lot of the shaykh who do speak out, they get put in prison. So
They do.
The rest also scared, or like not scared, but as in like imagine before it was you had the waqf system where the money that was used to provide for the
Yeah.
schools, but now when it's state sponsored, like they don't really have much of a choice.
Absolutely.
If
It's-
they speak out,
Yeah, it's true, but it's not about the choice, right?
yeah.
As in, you know, ultimately, if you're in a position where you're the inheritor of Allah's ilm, well, you know, the ilm in Quran and in hadith, you know, you have to be sincere to that.
Imam Ahmad.
Yeah. You know, Imam Ahmad as an example, Al-Izz ibn Abd salam. There's lots of examples of scholars who took the correct stance. Not just scholars, by the way, even people that were, that were just armed.
To what extent does, so when Ammar ibn Yasir, when he was forced into the situation of making a statement of kufr, or like basically making a statement against Islam, to what extent, yes, the scholars are an example, but like when you're, essentially it's like if your life is at stake, to what, like when you have kind of like an excuse in a sense where you also want to preserve your life, but you also want to speak the truth. Because you know the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where it's like if you can't,
Sallallahu alaihi
if you
wasallam.
can't do, like essentially if you can't do anything about it, then like speak out against it. If you can't
Yes.
speak out against it, then
Hate
hate
it.
it within your heart. To what extent do these scholars hold on to that?
I don't think any of the examples, contemporarily speaking, the scholars were asked to renounce their deen. That's probably the answer. So therefore, the stance is pretty clear. Because it's not about, for example, without naming names or going into particular examples, nobody's asked today, really, in terms of the scholarly establishment in the Muslim world to renounce Islam. Right? They're just told not to say the correct thing. Right? And ultimately, you've got to say the correct thing. Right? Speak the truth even if it goes against you. Right? And it's difficult, but for somebody what you can't fathom is that somebody who studied the Islamic text, who understands, the dimensions that rizq is fixed, that ajal is fixed, as an example from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he should know that it's imperative, or she should know that it's imperative to say the truth in that matter. And if he or she is unable to do that, then they have to question the depth of their belief and the certainty upon which it's established.
I was just playing devil's advocate.
I know, yeah, I know. Absolutely. Bismillah. And you seek inspiration from Bilal ibn Rawaha. Whilst Ammar bin Yasir, denounced, right? And he was given the permission to do that retrospectively by Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But Bilal, man, resolute, he didn't. They would say that when the people would come from Medina to do Hajj in Mecca, they could hear the screams of Bilal. Right? They could hear him screaming. Right? And they would say that the rock that was put on the chest of Bilal, if you were to take a piece of meat, you can fry it on it. You can cook the meat. That's what Amr bin al-As said before he became Muslim. That was how hot it was, because it was, you guys have been, anybody who's been to Mecca, Medina, or the Hijaz, like 12 o'clock heat, August. It's like, we have AC and fans and we're like dying, right? But it's just crazy, subhanAllah. So, now we're going to talk about invasions. And I want to lay out a framework, inshallah, brothers and sisters, about the framework of invasions and the various interests that are in play. So for Western nations, genuinely, philosophically speaking, there are a number of different interests. And certain invasions are motivated by one interest more than the other. Right? So for example, sometimes some invasions are motivated more by ideology and worldview. So a few sessions ago, we spoke about the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. For the Western Bloc, which was the US, it believed in free market capitalism, believed that man's happiness will come through his indefinite material pursuit of material pleasures. And capitalism, which is free market, let anything be a commodity, is the best way to do that. Whilst the Eastern Bloc, which was the communists, believed in equality. Man's happiness and true freedom will come through equality. So they believed in communism. So some wars are explained by, ideology and worldview. Other wars and invasions are explained by economic corporations, right? Financiers who have a particular interest within a particular piece of land and would support their government, make deals with the government in order to encourage them to go into those conflicts. And the last is national or international political interests, right? National and international political interests. So the wars that we spoke about in the first session, the Anglo-Ottoman Wars as an example, the desire to destroy the Ottomans, for instance, that was largely national interest. World War I and World War II in particular, so World War I was essentially a war between Germany and the United Kingdom, really, and it was about the control over the waterways, right? Who was going to be the sea power? So it was national interest. World War II was, of course, one form of nationalism versus another form of nationalism, right? So it was, the domination of one race over another race. The irony is that they're all Europeans, right? So those are the different. And democracy is interesting because it's ultimately a way in which those various different interests are fulfilled, are facilitated, right? Ultimately, right? Unfortunately, the illusion is that we have some say in how those interests are managed. We have little to no say, really, right? Rather, the democratic system becomes an institution by which the people are brought on board, right? Oh yeah, this war looks really bad. What's your opinion? This is my opinion. Cool, no worries, we'll do it anyway. Oh, this is really bad. What's your opinion? Oh, this is your opinion. Look, we're agreeing with you, right? It's ultimately managed, right? And it gives people an illusion. So, the first one was this. The war on Afghanistan after 9/11, right? After 9/11. So this was after, of course, a narrative of allying Islam with terrorism, right? Aligning Islam with terrorism. And there were a number of different justifications given to the Afghan war. 9/11 was one of them, right? That, okay, Al-Qaeda did it, right? And they had their proofs, etc. And they used that as the basis, right? They also said they wanted to rid the Afghan woman of the burqa, right? So ideologically, right? The narrative was that these Muslims hate freedom, hate democracy, hate civil liberties. Do you see? It's ideologically driving the people to support the Afghan war. The other narrative is that war on terror, which is what it came to be, was an act of self-defense against these Muslim terrorists, because Islam is terrorism. So war on terror, the invasions were demonstrated or presented to be an act of self-defense. And also, by the way, from the American position, all of the other nations need to join us as well. I don't care what domestic problems you have. I don't care if like half your population is in poverty. Everybody has to join us as well. For instance, Musharraf famously cited Richard Armitage, who was the former US Secretary of State. And he basically said, he threatened him, and he said Pakistan will be bombed back to the Stone Age if they did not comply with US foreign policy. Pakistan had nothing really to do with Afghanistan at that time, right? But it was forced in, right? It was forced in. You had drone attacks across the Pakistani-Afghani border. Almost 4 million Afghans fled to neighboring Pakistan and Iran. This is all within the first 9 months, right? And then you had the taking of Kabul, and you had a dire humanitarian situation. Dire humanitarian situation. And you had a number of different injustices that were carried out. Does anybody know who this is? So this is Raymond Davies. So this is something called the Raymond Davies affair. So he was a CIA operative who was given a task, right? Like I said, there's also economic interests, right? So private security firms had a lot of benefit from wars, right? You know, wars make a lot of money at the end of the day. Raymond Davies was a private security. Well, he worked for the CIA, but he was privately contracted. He was in Lahore. You know, he was driving around looking for, you know, Muslim terrorists, essentially. Saw a random guy on a motorbike, shot him, shot someone else, ran, drove off, ran a number of people over, right? Did somebody say something? That is terrorism, yeah, absolutely. It's terrorism, right? And then went into the American embassy. Guess what happened to him? Nothing. Nothing, zilch. Nothing happened to him. He was sent home back to America, where he lives happily with his parents. And guess what happened to his wife? No, she committed suicide. She committed suicide. Because her husband is dead. Who's going to bring money? Right? She's got no justice. She went into a significant mental health spiral. And I'm sure only Allah knows whether the pen was lifted off her. But she ended her life.
Whose wife was this?
One of the guys who was killed by Raymond Davies. Not Raymond Davies' wife, no. One of the guys who was killed by Raymond Davies.
Like a very eerily similar story happened in as well, like in 2014 in Iraq, by some American mercenaries. Like 3 of them ended up killing like 21 innocents. Like they're just randomly shooting in the streets. Blackwater. And
Blackwater.
Yeah, and he was exonerated a couple of years later.
Yes.
Celebrated in the American media. Like, solid.
Did you get that from Mehdi Hassan? He mentioned that in one of the debates.
So we've also got, you know, for instance, Afia Siddiqui, Dr. Afia Siddiqui, Allah release her, Ameen. And you know, there's some powerful stuff. You know, she was taken in. You know, there's no evidence to implicate her, but ultimately she has become such a big case. You know, there's a very famous lawyer called Clive Stafford Smith. I'd encourage you to follow him on Twitter. He is the principal lawyer who is fighting the case of Afia Siddiqui. He himself has fought the case of 77, from what I recall, Guantanamo detainees and has released them. And he does it all for free, right? And he was asked, why do you go through so much trouble? He quotes 2 reasons. He says, my mother is the first one, because his mother encouraged him to study law for the benefit of people. And the second, he said, I am trying to correct the ills of my country. He's American. Right? May Allah guide him to Islam. I mean, wallahi, when you listen to him, you feel like you're listening to a Muslim in terms of his principles. And may Allah guide him to Islam. I mean,
what was his name?
Clyde Stafford Smith. And then you've got Muazzam Beg. Then you had what is now known as the Second Gulf War. The first one, if you guys remember, it was when Saddam Hussein took Kuwait, and then Saudi Arabia thought that they were under threat. So they asked the Americans to come. The Americans came in, built loads of bases, orchestrated something called Operation Desert Shield, and then they launched a full-on offensive, which was known as Operation Desert Storm, right? Do you know what the US invasion in America was called? Because they give these names, right?
What, the second one?
The first one,
No.
after 9/11.
Wasn't it like very religious?
No, after the second Gulf War was the Operation Iraqi Freedom, wasn't it?
No. So it was, of course, war on terror, but it was called Operation Infinite Justice. That's what the Americans called their war in Afghanistan. And the irony is that they leave with their heads bowed. So, Iraq. These are the orchestrators of the Iraq War. You've got Donald Rumsfeld, you've got Dick Cheney, and you've got George Bush Jr. Now, essentially, it's very well known that, by the way, the first Gulf War in 1990, Operation Desert Storm, was orchestrated by his dad, George Bush Sr. And the actual plan was to take Iraq then, right? So if you remember the three kind of aspects to any nation's political action, Iraq was very much a mixture of ideology, as it always is, and corporations. Because Iraq is one of the most fertile lands when it comes to black gold, oil. But during the 1990s, there was not enough evidence to basically allow a war like that to happen. The American public wouldn't have it. So what do you have to do? You have to create a narrative. So Afghanistan was all about self-defense, was all about that these Muslim terrorists are there to take our freedoms, take our democracy and our civil liberties away from us. Right? And previously, terrorism was only applied to non-state actors. Right? At that time. So, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the PLO, etc. Now you saw the development of the term terrorism. And the argument was made was that any Muslim nation, whether it's non-state or nation, that acts against US interests, right, is a terrorist state. And we have to defend ourselves from this by invading them. Right? We've got to defend ourselves by invading them. Right? So you had this creation of a narrative known as weapons of mass destruction. Right? Weapons of mass destruction. And this was a global campaign about proving, or trying to prove, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction in order to further the war on terror narrative. So you had a number of different things. So the first thing was the UN inspection. So the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1441, and from November 2002 until March 2003, UN inspectors went into Iraq. And guess what they found? Nothing. No weapons of mass destruction. Zilch. They did 900 inspections at 500 sites. They found nothing. Does anybody know who this guy is?
Did he get taken?
Anybody know who he might be? His name is Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi. Right? You can read about him. You know, you need evidence, right? Somewhat. I mean, the evidential standard with the Iraq war was very low. Right? Very low. But they needed some form of evidence. So they took this guy, right? And they tortured him. He was locked in a tiny box. This is well known. So Cage did an entire investigation. He was locked in a tiny box which was 20 inches high, and he was held for 17 hours at a time. And then he was let out to be kicked and punched. Right? And then he was waterboarded again and again and again and again. And there's only so much that a man can take. And they took his finger and they signed and they put his finger on a piece of paper that said that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. And then you had the creation of the dodgy dossier, which was a dossier that was created by Tony Blair, who redefined British politics from the point of view of Britain has to do everything from this point on that America does in order to stay relevant in international politics, which is why we see UK walking side by side with America on the Israeli issue at the moment, right? So this dodgy dossier apparently collated evidence for the weapons of mass destruction. It had no evidence. Part of it was copied by a PhD that was done by somebody at an American university, right? And part of it was just, you know, the testimony under duress of this individual. So this fabrication of, there is Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and there is, of course, weapons of mass destruction, led to the actual Iraq war. None of this would have happened if it wasn't for these guys, though. None of this would have happened if it wasn't for these guys, though. Because ultimately, you've got to think, how did these people get tortured? And you know what, the torturing on the war on terror was unbelievable in terms of its scale. How did the Brits and the US and France get away with all of this mass torture? The answer is that it never happened on their soil. Right? It happened on this soil. Right? It happened on this soil. And this is incredibly well known. Okay? Bismillah. And what happened in Iraq?
Can I ask?
Yes.
How is Muammar al-Gaddafi related to this?
How is Muammar Gaddafi related to this? So it's well known that this man, Sheikh al-Libi, was tortured in Libya. That could have only happened if there was some form of deal, essentially. Yeah. There's a full investigation into his life, by the way, and how it happened. He was taken from state to state to state to state, taken away from his family, and he was tortured in Libya. And that's where the confession came.
Because I have this idea, I don't know if this is true or not.
It's okay.
Muammar al-Gaddafi was supporting Saddam Hussein.
No, they've always been enemies, or were always enemies.
Yeah, they were always enemies. Yeah, they were always enemies. There came a point where the Arab rulers did support Saddam Hussein. It was too little too late. The reason for support was actually quoted by Muammar Gaddafi in the Arab League summit, straight after Saddam was killed. And he basically said, why are you guys all laughing? You guys are all next. Right? It's on YouTube. Right? So all of the Al-Assad, everybody's laughing, and he says, I've been telling you this, you know, we're next. And that's what happened. But they've always been competitors. Yes.
Was it also the time of the trying to change the currency and stuff off the US dollar back to the dollar?
That we'll talk about next session, inshallah.
Who was
Yes.
bottom line?
You just named the different soil on the previous.
Yeah, of course. So you've got Syrian soil, right? And even now, you know, the paramilitary paradigm still exists. You know, sometimes unfortunately, you know, you would call us the Mujahideen as an example. They would get played by state actors all the time. The Syrian revolution was a very good example of this, where all of a sudden you had thousands of people who were in prison, in Assad's prison, just released. Right? All of a sudden, I think this happened in 2015, right? Just all of a sudden, right? But then, you know, it's no coincidence that, you know, shortly after that you have ISIS, right? You know, unfortunately, we have a knack of getting played as Muslims. That's Libyan soil, Muammar Gaddafi. That's Hosni Mubarak, and Egyptian soil. And of course, that's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and Iranian soil. They either facilitated the torture or they facilitated the invasion. Right? The legacy is disastrous. Right? People were tortured, detained, sexually assaulted. The crimes within Abu Ghuraib was, you could just read about them, brothers and sisters, if you have the heart to. Starvation, burning, severe violence, all of this happened. This is only, in the last 15 years, 15 to 20 years, right? 780 people were transferred to Guantanamo. In Guantanamo, once you're in there, it's very, very, very difficult to come out, right? You're forced to sign false confessions. You're trialed in a military court where there's very little chance of you getting any sort of amnesty. It's a very good film that you guys should watch called The Mauritanian. Yeah, very good movie. If you haven't read Muazzam Beg's biography, which is Enemy Combatant, I would recommend you read it. It's a very good read. And people all over the Muslim and non-Muslim world, and even today, just get picked up. Right? Just get picked up. Right? I don't mean to scare you guys. You shouldn't be scared. Yeah? Because if there's no reason for you to get picked up, you won't get picked up, right? But people are approached. Right? It happens in London all the time. Right? Happens in London all the time. You'll be going to get your train on the tube, and there'll be somebody standing there. This happened to two friends of mine. And they'll say, hello, your name is X, Y, and Z. We'd like to speak to you. We're from the Foreign Office. Of course, you don't speak to them, right? You just go. Right?
Are you allowed to do that?
Yeah, of course. They are allowed to do that, yes?
So are you allowed to just leave?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Thank you.
It's all right, yeah. Just leave. Just leave, inshallah. Yes.
It happened to me, man. But they didn't tell me they were from the Foreign Office or whatever you said.
Really?
In the tube.
In the tube?
Yeah. They just stopped me randomly and said, listen, we think you look like this type of person or this sort of group. And they started patting me down. He just showed me his badge. Yeah.
It's normal, brothers and sisters. It's so sad, but it's normal. It happens. And you know what? People's lives are ruined as a result of this. Yeah? People's lives are ruined. So the additional point I want to make before we really wrap up, inshallah, because we're almost at the end now, is about oil. Oil was definitely an interest. You should watch this movie called Vice. It's about Dick Cheney, right? And it explains a lot of that about the Iraqi war. There's a number of different statements that prove the fact that a big motivating factor with Iraq was Iraqi oil, right? If you go to Iraq now, Iraqi oil in Iraq is quite expensive, right? So at the moment you're paying like £1, £1.38 per litre, right? As an example. Here. No, it's £1.38, yeah, I filled up yesterday, man. Where'd you live, bro? MashaAllah, yeah. Us Leeds man, then we get a discount, alhamdulillah. So, but it's, yeah, £1.38, whatever it might be, right? When I went to Iraq, which was a year and a half ago, it was about, for a gallon of petrol, it was about 80 pence, which is actually a lot of money for Iraqis. To put that into context, do you know how much oil costs in Saudi Arabia for a gallon? Habibi, you must. Or Bahrain.
It costs about 40p a litre.
40p a litre. 40p a litre. But if you look, Iraqi oil is comparatively quite expensive. Because you've got Shell and BP that have got all of their fingers all over that land. Right? So oil is definitely a factor. So what are the real life repercussions of war on terror? The average man, the average Muslim has suffered. Actually, the average man has suffered due to war on terror. The narrative suggests that the deaths, wars, torture, injustices that have occurred in Muslim lands to Muslim people is ultimately the fault of Muslims. Right? It's ultimately the fault of Muslims. The argument is made that Islam is intrinsically violent, that Muslims are intrinsically violent. You've had the closing of charities, schools, the creation of draconian legislation such as Prevent, CVE, even in the Muslim world, as an example. Conflicts are seen differently. You know, you don't see anybody putting a Palestinian flag on the Eiffel Tower today, do you? But when Ukraine happened, you know, it was, people were getting it tattooed on their cheeks, right? We have to substitute the flag for a watermelon in order to remain compliant, right? Conflicts are seen. Dehumanization takes place as a result of war and terror. The average man experiences, the average Muslim man or woman experiences Western injustice left, right and center. He sees lack of accountability in his lands. He sees the West propping up dictators that continue to oppress their people. He sees his children as young as 4 or 5 years old get referred to Prevent. That just perpetuates things. It just makes things worse. That person gets angry and then he takes up some action which is not allowed in Islam. But he's put in a circumstance where he feels that he can't do anything. And of course, Islamic terrorism versus lone wolf mental health issue terrorism. This is a study by the Muslim Council of Britain in 2018, State of Media Reporting on Islam and Muslims. 59% of all articles associated Muslims with negative behavior. 37% of articles in right-leaning and religious publications were categorized with the most negative rating of very, very biased. Over a third of all articles misrepresented or generalized about Muslims. And of course, in all of those articles, terrorism, surprise, surprise, was the most common theme. Right? And of course, you've got, you know, contradictions in cases. Right? You've got Shamima Begum, who came from East London, who was, 15 or 14 at the time, who, interestingly, was in contact with a Canadian intelligence officer. Right? This is still under investigation, but it's pretty obvious it was because there were lots of leaks. So, and then she went off to Syria. Right? You have Rhiannon Rudd from Essex, east part of London, who came into contact with far-right materials at the age of 15, and she plotted a number of attacks on mosques around the country. She was groomed, she was in full control. But the lives of both of them are destroyed. She killed herself, Rhiannon Rudd. She actually took her own life, right? And she's stranded. No citizenship, nothing at all. But the hypocrisy is incredibly clear. Really, it's about the creation of a global ontology. It's a worldview about Muslims. That's what's culminated in this. It is a vicious cycle. The whole idea about Muslims are terrorists. This is like, it's almost a fact. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. It's almost become a fact that Muslims are extreme, Muslims are terrorists, they want violence, etc., etc., etc. And every arm of every agency around the world has contributed to this narrative. Muslims continue to feel increasingly persecuted and isolated, and we're viewed with an eye of suspicion. That's why I said at the start, it's like holding on to a hot coal. Your rights are taken away. Muslims are not given the same rights internationally as anybody else. Look at the ICJ ruling, right? I'm sure different people have different perspectives on it. Look at the clear contravention of every UN resolution and Geneva Convention known to man that's happening today. Does anybody care? Not at all, in terms of the political establishment. The people care. People see the contradictions, right? However, torture occurred. You're bastions of freedom and civil liberties, but you carry out a mass surveillance program and torture. But that contradiction is not seen. It's not talked about. Muslim regimes fund Western counter-extremism policies. The UAE is the biggest example of this. Much of the funding that comes in from America in terms of CVE, which is their policy, their prevent, and the UK, much of it comes from the United Arab Emirates, right? Huge amount of it. And you've got the rise of the far right. There was an interesting, if you really want to understand historically some of the things that we experience, I would highly recommend, Insha'Allah, reading about the Spanish Inquisition. Because in Valencia, everybody knows Valencia? Yeah. Valencia, right? You had the political establishment of Valencia were pretty corrupt, right? They were stealing from the poor and giving to the rich. Similar thing happens, by the way, in Western democracies. It's just better. It's just hidden, yeah? And you had Muslims who were hardworking, law-abiding, educated, contributing in many, many spaces, right? Contributing in many, many spaces. And the people were upset. The non-Muslim population were upset. They were thinking, we ain't got no money left. It's all going to the government. So what does the government do? The government steers the attention to the minority. Oh, don't forget about the Moors, which is the Muslims. They're like this, they're like that. They do this, they can do this, they can do that. So where the average person, and I honestly believe this, the average far right guy, Tony, Dave, Sharon, whoever they may be, who's suffering as a result of, lack of distribution of wealth, poor policies, high rates of taxation, like income tax is the most stupid concept I've ever known, right? Is not pointing his anger and frustrations at the government that actually control financing. Rather, it's, these Muslims want to take over, right? These Muslims want to, take the world. You believe in Sharia or Sharon's law, whatever it might be, right? But ultimately, the government facilitates this.
Would you say the far left also have some sort of...
Yeah, of course.
In terms of good Muslims
yes.
From and whatnot?
100%. 100%. Oppression in the East. The war on terror has led to furthering of the oppression in the East. Does anybody know who this geezer is? What did he say? Yeah. He said, when I win trophies in Germany, I'm German. When I step out of line, I'm Turkish. Because he spoke up against the Uyghur genocide. This happened at the same time as Black Lives Matter. Why was he punished?
I think
correct. Because of business deals with China. Right? So he was punished. But nobody was punished with Black Lives Matter. Right? It was celebrated. And that's fair enough. But let's be consistent with conflicts and oppression. Right?
I think another example on the other side is, I think LeBron James, he made a statement, I think, about China, and then he quickly deleted it.
Changed it, yeah.
And then he posted, he's like, oh, China's so great.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about business interests.
Around about the similar time, I think.
So China and its policies against the Uyghur Muslims, Myanmar and its policies against the Rohingya Muslims of Rakhine province. So how have we responded as a Muslim community to the war on terror narrative? We've actually jumped on the narrative, some of us. We've started to define ourselves according to the same definition of good and bad Muslims that was imposed on us by Western nations, right? It's very dangerous. What constitutes an extremist and what doesn't constitute an extremist, right? We need to look from our own tradition about what is extremist and what is not an extremist, what is a terrorist and what is not a terrorist, what is legitimate, resistance versus what is not legitimate resistance. Not have that imposed by somebody else or someone else. The other response is bury your head in the sands. And there are lots of people that believe in this. It will blow over. Bury your head in the sands. Don't say anything. Don't step out of line. Just carry on doing doing your day to day. And that's been the narrative for decades. And the oppression gets worse and worse and worse. The war on terror narrative gets deeper and deeper and deeper. It defines everything. We say something, it can be held against us on a war on terror narrative. That's the reality. Let's circumvent. Let's not challenge the narrative. Let's not talk about how the injustices of war and terror, the lack of empirical evidence that informs policies like CVE and Prevent. Let's circumvent it. Let's do more food banks, hand out more roses, talk more about having an upright moral code, which are all good aspects of Islam. They're all valid aspects of Islam. They're all rewardable aspects of Islam. But they do very little to change a global, media-pumped, government-backed narrative. Let's just be honest with the situation. Or we can challenge the narrative, as Musa alayhi salam did in the ayat that our brother Rafi recited. Fir'aun said to him, do you not remember the favors that I did for you? Little boy, you grew up in my palace. I gave you clothes. I gave you honor because he was from Banu Israel. I gave you all of this, right? Gave you education, gave you this, gave you work, gave you income, gave you that paycheck at the end of the month, gave you all of this. And Musa turns around, alayhi salam, and says, look, at that time, I was previously jahil. I didn't have Islam. But now I've come to you with the message to correct what you have done because of your enslavement of Banu Israel. He just turned the narrative on him. Don't point the finger at me that I'm being ungrateful. Let's talk about the subject matter at hand, the fact that you are oppressing a people. And let's start from there. So we adopt, Insha'Allah, as the final slide, the engagement of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the prophets. And there are so many examples of the conversations that the prophets have with the tyrants of their time. We have to follow political events, brothers and sisters. I can't stress that. If Gaza has taught us anything, it has taught us that we are so politically illiterate. So politically. Despite our tradition being from some of the most politically literate people. When I first started, I said the example of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We gave the example of Surah Al-Rum. The Sahaba were sat discussing the battle with the Quraysh between the Romans and the Persians. These were the sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the tarbiyah of the Sahaba was that they were engaged with the reality of the time. We got to recognize that governments and media push particular narratives and they have interests, ideological interests, corporate interests, nation-state interests. We have to think twice before taking a side. All right? We have to think twice before. Are we going to ally with the liberal left? Are we going to ally with the far right? Where is our narrative coming from? If you give me a few minutes. We've got to intellectually challenge the war on terror narrative. We've got to cite its injustices and point out its contradictions. And Insha'Allah maintain the upright character of Islam. We are the best representatives of our deen, no doubt. People's experiences of Islam is going to come from us. So we've got to make sure that our game is strong, inshallah. And knowing that there's no point despairing, because the truth will always be victorious. The nasr is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah says, وَنَصْرٌ قَرِيب, it's close. وَبَشِّرِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, right? So glad tidings to the believers. But we're ultimately held accountable on these things. Whether we can gain the knowledge in the correct areas and be advocates of the Islamic perspective on these deep, dark issues. I'll end it there, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.